It started like any other summer move. Jack and Deborah Sullivan had spent years saving up for a better life, and when they found the old duplex on Chase Street in a quiet neighborhood in West Pittston, Pennsylvania, it felt like destiny. The house had a history, sure, but most of them did in this part of the state. It was large, affordable, and most importantly, it gave them the chance to live under the same roof as Jack's elderly parents, sharing the duplex while maintaining some privacy. The first few weeks were filled with the normal chaos of settling in. Moving boxes, broken appliances, learning where the creaky steps were, and getting to know the neighborhood. Jack worked in maintenance at a local manufacturing plant, while Deborah stayed home with their 4 daughters, Jillian, Madison, Emma, and little Grace, who had just turned 2. Life was busy but full of hope. Then the power outages began. They started small, just flickering lights or the occasional fuse blown when nothing unusual was running. Jack shrugged it off as old wiring. But one evening, while Deborah was folding laundry in the basement, the lights surged brightly, then cut out completely. As she stood there in the darkness, clutching a damp towel, she heard a low growl echo from the corner of the room. It didn't sound like a dog. Sounded wrong. Heavy. Wet. Deborah bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind her. She didn't tell Jack. She figured maybe she'd imagined it, the way darkness can play tricks on a tired mind. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next several days, strange things began to happen more frequently. One night, Madison screamed from her room, claiming a shadowy figure had stood over her bed. Another evening, Jack's mother, who lived in the adjoining unit, asked if they had left the back door open. She'd heard someone walking through the hallway, whispering. But when Jack checked, the house was locked tight. Things escalated quickly after that. Deborah started hearing banging in the walls late at night. Not the kind that squirrels make or old pipes. This was rhythmic, deliberate. Jillian, the oldest, began waking up with bruises she couldn't explain. Emma stopped talking altogether for a while, wide-eyed and withdrawn. Jack remained skeptical, but even he couldn't ignore the way his tools went missing from the basement, only to turn up in strange places. The bathroom sink, the oven, even the baby's crib. One afternoon, Deborah heard Grace laughing upstairs. She figured the toddler was playing with her dolls. But when she peeked into the room, Grace was standing in the corner, giggling at the empty air. When Deborah asked her what was so funny, Grace simply pointed and said, "The lady with no eyes." Deborah's skin crawled. Jack started to see things too, quick glimmers of movement in the corners of his vision. Once, while shaving, he caught the reflection of someone standing behind him. But when he turned, the bathroom was empty. He didn't mention it to Deborah, not at first. He didn't want to feed into what he assumed were her growing anxieties. But deep down he was scared too. It wasn't long before the smells began. Horrible rotting odors that would flood parts of the house and vanish just as quickly. They tried everything. They cleaned the plumbing, called an exterminator, even had the heating ducts inspected. Nothing helped. And then came the dreams. Deborah started waking up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding. Her dreams were always the same. She was trapped in a small, dark space, and something was breathing with her, watching her. One night, she woke up screaming, her arms covered in scratches that hadn't been there when she went to bed. Jack tried to tell her it was just sleepwalking. But then he found identical marks on his own back a week later. They turned to their local priest, Father Callahan, who came to bless the house. He walked through each room, sprinkling holy water and saying prayers, but the moment he stepped into the basement, he stopped. Deborah said he turned pale, looked at the floor, and whispered a prayer she didn't recognize. After the blessing, things quieted down. For a week. Then all hell broke loose. On a cold November night, Jillian was violently thrown from her bed. Not fell. Thrown. She hit the wall with a sickening thud and screamed for help. When Jack ran into the room, he found her sobbing, her leg twisted at a painful angle. She kept screaming that something had picked her up and hurled her like a rag doll. They took her to the hospital. The doctor said she had a sprained ankle and some deep bruising, but no broken bones. He asked how it happened. Jack lied, saying she slipped on the stairs. But Deborah knew they couldn't keep hiding what was going on. They tried to move, but they were stuck. Financially, they couldn't afford to sell the house. Not in its condition. And now, nobody in the family felt safe sleeping alone. They reached out to a local paranormal investigator named Sarah Holloway, who had worked on some well-known hauntings in the area. She brought a small team with her, recording equipment, thermal cameras, motion sensors. She spent 2 nights in the house, documenting everything. On the second night, something scratched her across the back while she was alone in the basement. She left immediately and called in reinforcements. Sarah connected the Sullivans with a couple who specialized in cases like theirs. Their names were Ed and Lorraine Bennett, paranormal researchers and demonologists who had made a name for themselves investigating the darkest of hauntings. They arrived in the middle of a snowstorm in early December. Lorraine was soft-spoken but alert. She walked through the house with quiet purpose, stopping frequently and closing her eyes as if listening to something no one else could hear. Ed asked the family detailed questions about the timeline of events, the smells, the physical attacks, and the apparitions. After their walkthrough, Ed sat Jack and Deborah down and didn't sugarcoat it. "What you're dealing with," he said, "isn't just a ghost. This house has been infested. There's a demonic presence here. Possibly more than one." Deborah felt the room spin. Jack gripped the arms of the chair. Lorraine reached for Deborah's hand. "We believe this may have started long before you moved in," she said. "The house has a dark history. There are reports of domestic violence, even possible occult activity. Something invited it in. And now it doesn't want to leave." The Bennetts performed a cleansing ritual that night, but the results were mixed. Doors slammed violently during the process. The candles Lorraine lit flickered and died one by one, even though there was no breeze. At one point Sarah, who had stayed to assist, began to convulse and speak in a voice that wasn't hers. The team barely got her stabilized. After the ritual, things quieted again. But Jack wasn't convinced it was over. And he was right. The house felt calmer for a few days after the cleansing. The banging stopped. The sulfuric stench that had hung in the hallway disappeared. Even the cold spots, which had become part of the family's daily life, faded. For a brief moment, Jack and Deborah Sullivan believed maybe, just maybe, they'd survived the worst. But peace doesn't last long when you're living with something that doesn't want to leave. A week after the ritual, Jack woke to the sound of water running. It was 3:14 in the morning. He got up, groggy and annoyed, assuming someone had left the kitchen tap on again. But when he reached the kitchen, it wasn't the sink. The faucet was dry. The sound was coming from the bathroom. He flicked on the light, and his stomach dropped. The tub was filled to the brim, although no one had touched it in hours. Worse still, the water was pitch black, almost like oil. A thick, swirling cloud hovered just above the surface, and Jack swore he saw something writhing beneath it, something with fingers. He backed out of the room and slammed the door. Moments later, when he mustered the courage to look again, the tub was empty, bone dry, not even damp. The next morning he didn't tell Deborah. He told himself it was a hallucination brought on by stress, or a half-dream. But when Deborah came downstairs holding Grace in her arms, her face pale, he knew he didn't imagine it. "Grace said she saw the lady with no eyes again," she whispered. But this time she said the lady was crying. From there, it was as if whatever had been hiding had returned. Stronger, smarter, crueler. The house grew heavier. Not just figuratively. Literally. Guests who visited commented on how thick the air felt. Some reported headaches, nosebleeds, or a crushing feeling in their chest. Father Callahan returned but refused to perform another blessing. He said he'd spoken to people higher up in the diocese, and they advised him not to engage any further without explicit church sanction. Desperate, the Sullivans allowed Sarah Holloway and her team to return with more sophisticated equipment. They placed cameras in every room, audio recorders under beds, EMF detectors in the attic and basement. Within hours of the setup, they began recording unexplainable activity. Footage showed doors closing on their own, chairs shifting slightly when no one was in the room. In one disturbing clip, Grace's stuffed rabbit floated off the dresser for 2 full seconds before crashing to the floor. Sarah's audio logs were worse. A deep, guttural voice could be heard saying things like, "You're mine," and "She belongs to me," followed by high-pitched laughter and something that sounded like a child crying. On the 4th night, the team picked up what appeared to be a growl that came from directly inside the wall, accompanied by scratching sounds like claws. Things turned violent again soon after. Emma was pushed down the stairs while carrying a toy box. She broke her wrist and hit her head hard enough to lose consciousness for several minutes. Gillian, still recovering from her earlier injury, started having full-blown night terrors. Screaming, crying, waking up with her hands bleeding from scratching the walls in her sleep. One night, Deborah awoke gasping for air. She said she felt hands around her throat, squeezing. Jack turned on the light and saw red marks around her neck, angry and fresh, as if someone had tried to strangle her. They tried sleeping in shifts. Jack stayed awake most nights with a baseball bat in his lap. He never saw anything, but he heard it. Footsteps pacing above them. Knocking that responded to questions. Whispers just behind his ears. He was slowly losing his mind. The final straw came in the middle of January. It was snowing hard, wind howling outside, when the power went out around midnight. Jack lit a few candles and checked the fuse box. Nothing. He came back inside to find the family huddled in the living room, bundled in blankets. Then they heard it. Lump, lump, lump. Something heavy coming down the stairs, step by step. Emma screamed and pointed. Gillian grabbed Grace and backed into the kitchen. Deborah stood frozen, one hand pressed to her mouth. At the bottom of the stairs stood a figure. Massive, tall, completely black. It was darker than the dark around it, like it soaked in the light. Its face was featureless, but the outline of its head seemed to shimmer, almost pulse. Jack raised the bat. The thing didn't move, just stood there. Then it let out a sound that no one in the family could ever fully describe. A mix between a roar and a scream, like a train slamming into a dying animal. The walls shook. The candles went out. And when the lights flickered back on 10 seconds later, it was gone. The Sullivans left that night. They packed what they could in the snowstorm and drove to Deborah's sister's house 3 towns over. For weeks, they refused to go back, even with the mortgage still bleeding them dry. Sarah, along with the Bennetts, tried to work with local officials to declare the home spiritually uninhabitable, but such terms didn't exist legally. Eventually, Ed and Lorraine returned with a priest from outside the state, one willing to perform a full exorcism. Took place over 2 full days. The house fought back. Walls bled. Crucifixes flipped upside down. An entire room was filled with a stench so vile the priest reportedly vomited mid-prayer. But the exorcism worked. Or at least that's what they said. Afterward the house felt still. Quiet. Months later, the Sullivans returned briefly to collect the rest of their belongings. Nothing strange happened. No sounds. No smells. No shadows. They sold the house at a loss to a young couple who'd never heard the story. The Bennetts documented everything in their files, and Sarah Holloway published a report in a small journal for paranormal researchers. The case gained some traction, eventually inspiring a low-budget film a few years later. Fictionalized, dramatized, and distorted for the screen. But for the Sullivans it was all too real. Deborah still wakes up some nights gasping, hand to her throat, certain for a moment that it's happening all over again. Jack never worked nights again. He refused to leave his family alone in the dark. The girls are grown now, with families of their own. None of them bought houses. They all rent. They never stay in one place too long. They don't talk much about West Pittston. But once in a while, one of them will hear a bump in the night, or catch a shadow in the corner of their vision, and feel that familiar weight on their chest. A reminder that some doors, once opened, never fully close.